Hey there, friend. Welcome back to another journey through the quieter, forgotten corners of biblical history. Tonight we're settling in for something a little different, a little heavier perhaps, but still designed to carry you gently towards sleep. Whether you're listening at midnight or during your afternoon rest, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this time with me exploring the ancient world. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all scattered across the globe, yet here together in this moment, diving into stories that shaped civilizations thousands of years ago. If this kind of gentle historical storytelling helps you unwind, consider subscribing. We have many more forgotten tales waiting to be told. Now let the day dissolve around you. Dim the lights if you can. Maybe turn on that soft background hum of a fan or gentle rain sounds. Tonight we're traveling back, way back, to a time when the Mediterranean sun beat down on dusty roads, when olive trees dotted the hillsides, and when the sound of grinding grain echoed from every household at dawn. Picture this. You're walking through the narrow streets of an ancient Israelite city. The smell of baking bread mingles with the scent of burning olive oil lamps. Children dart between the shadows of mud brick houses, their laughter echoing off stone walls. Women carry water jars balanced perfectly on their heads, their movements graceful despite the weight. Everything seems peaceful, ordered, blessed even. But step a little closer, look a little deeper, because beneath this pastoral scene lies a harsh reality that would make our modern complaints about dating apps and mortgage rates seem like gentle inconveniences. We're about to explore one of the most vulnerable positions anyone could find themselves in during biblical times. Not the lepers, though their suffering was immense. Not the slaves, though their bondage was crushing. Tonight we're talking about widows. Yes, widows. And before you think this might be a gentle tale of community support and divine providence, let me stop you right there. Because being a widow in biblical times wasn't just about grief and loneliness. It was about stepping into a social category so precarious, so legally powerless, so economically devastating, that it literally became synonymous with destitution and desperation. The Hebrew word for widow, almana, doesn't just mean woman whose husband has died. It carries with it connotations of silence, emptiness, abandonment. In a society where a woman's entire identity, legal standing, and economic security flowed through her relationship to men, first her father, then her husband, then hopefully her sons. Losing that connection wasn't just personal tragedy, it was social death. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the beginning, with a typical woman's life in ancient Israel, so you can understand just how catastrophic widowhood really was. Meet Sarah. Not the Sarah of Abraham, but Sarah the potter's daughter from a small village outside Jerusalem. Sarah's story begins like most women's stories of her time, with absolutely no agency whatsoever. At 13, her father arranged her marriage to Eli, a farmer 15 years her senior. She had never spoken to Eli beyond polite greetings at the well. She knew nothing about him except that he owned 3 goats and a small plot of barley. The negotiation for Sarah's hand wasn't romantic. It was economic. Her father and Eli's father spent weeks haggling over the bride price, the mohar. How many silver shekels would Eli's family pay for the privilege of taking Sarah off her father's hands? How much grain would Sarah's family provide as her dowry? What household goods would she bring to her new life? Notice what's missing from these negotiations. Sarah's opinion, her feelings, her hopes for the future. In biblical times, a woman didn't choose her husband. She was chosen for him, by him, often without ever being consulted. The idea that marriage should involve love, compatibility, or even basic attraction was not just foreign, it was potentially dangerous. Marriage was about survival, economic security, and the continuation of family lines. Sarah's wedding day arrived with little fanfare. There was a feast, yes, but she spent most of it sitting silently while the men of both families drank wine and discussed livestock prices. When the sun set, she was led to Eli's house, her new home, where she would spend the rest of her life serving not just her husband, but his extended family. And what was her new life like? Exhausting, unrelenting, dangerous. Sarah rose before dawn each day to grind grain for bread, not with a convenient kitchen appliance, but with heavy stone querns that left her arms aching and her back screaming. She hauled water from the village well, carrying heavy clay jars that, if dropped, meant no water for drinking, cooking, or washing until someone could make the journey again. She tended the family's small vegetable garden, fought off insects and birds that wanted to destroy their meager crops. She spun wool into thread, wove thread into cloth, sewed cloth into garments for her growing family. She cooked every meal over an open fire, ground every grain by hand, preserved every piece of food for the lean months. And then there were the babies. Sarah's primary purpose, according to everyone around her, was to produce children, preferably sons. The moment she was married, the countdown began. If she didn't conceive within the first year, whispers started. Was she barren? Had God cursed her? Was her husband considering taking a second wife? Pregnancy in biblical times was a death sentence that you might survive. There were no prenatal vitamins, no ultrasounds, no sterile delivery rooms. When Sarah's time came, she laboured alone except for the village midwives, women whose knowledge came from experience and superstition rather than medical training. Many women died in childbirth. Many babies died in their first year. Sarah was fortunate. She survived the birth of 5 children, though only 3 lived to adulthood. Each pregnancy left her weaker, each birth a gamble with death that she somehow won. But here's what made Sarah's situation tolerable. What made all of this back-breaking work and constant danger bearable? She had protection. Legal protection, economic protection, social protection, all flowing from one source, her husband Eli. As long as Eli lived, Sarah had a place in the world. She belonged to his household. She was covered by his legal standing. When disputes arose, Eli spoke for her in the city gates where the elders gathered to settle matters. When economic hardship struck, Eli made the decisions about what to sell, what to keep, how to survive. Sarah couldn't own property independently. She couldn't enter into contracts. She couldn't represent herself in legal matters. She couldn't even travel freely without male escort. But she didn't need to, because Eli did all of these things for her. The system worked in its way as long as the man at the center of it stayed alive. And then one morning, after 18 years of marriage, Eli didn't wake up. It started as a fever, nothing unusual in a world where disease was common and medicine primitive. Eli complained of chills, took to his bed, asked Sarah to bring him some of her herbal tea. She did, of course. She nursed him through 3 days of sweats and delirium, holding cool cloths to his forehead, forcing him to sip water, praying to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob for healing. But the fever didn't break. On the 4th morning, Eli's breathing became laboured. By afternoon, it had stopped altogether. Just like that, Sarah's world ended. Not dramatically. Not with thunder and lightning or plagues of locusts. Just quietly, with the last breath of a man who had been the centre of her legal, economic, and social existence for nearly 2 decades. You might think the immediate aftermath would be about grief, about mourning the loss of her life partner. And yes, Sarah mourned. She tore her clothes as custom demanded. She wailed with the other women who came to sit with her. She observed the proper period of ritual uncleanness. But beneath the grief was something far more terrifying, the dawning realization that she no longer existed in the eyes of the law. Let me explain what I mean by that. In biblical times, women had no independent legal identity. A woman was always someone's daughter, someone's wife, someone's mother. She was defined entirely by her relationship to men. When Eli died, Sarah didn't just lose a husband. She lost her legal standing as a person. She couldn't inherit Eli's property directly. Under Israelite law, inheritance passed through the male line. If Eli had sons, they would inherit. If he had no sons but had brothers, they might inherit. If he had no brothers, the property might go to his father or his nearest male relative. Sarah got nothing. Or rather, she got whatever the male heir decided to give her, if anything. Now, Sarah did have 2 sons, which should have helped. In theory, they could provide for her in her widowhood. But here's the cruel mathematics of ancient life. Her sons were 12 and 14 years old, children themselves, too young to own property, too young to provide economic security, too young to represent her interests in legal matters. Her eldest daughter had already been married off to a family in the next village. Once a daughter married, she belonged to her husband's family. She might visit occasionally, might feel sympathy for her widowed mother, but she had no legal obligation to provide support. Her loyalty, her resources, her very identity now belonged to her husband's household. So, there Sarah sat, in the house that had been her home for 18 years, suddenly aware that it wasn't really her house at all. It belonged to Eli's family line, and while her young sons were technically the heirs, they were minors, which meant that Eli's brother, Nathan, would serve as guardian of the property until the boys came of age. Nathan was not a kind man. He had always resented Eli's slightly larger inheritance, had always coveted the family's small but fertile plot of land. Now, with Eli dead and only a widow and 2 children standing between him and effective control of that property, Nathan saw opportunity. The first sign of trouble came just a week after the mourning period ended. Nathan arrived at Sarah's door with a cart and 2 of his sons. "Sarah," he said, not unkindly, but with the tone of a man conducting business, "we need to discuss the situation here." The situation. Not her grief, not her loss, not her need for support during the most difficult time of her life. The situation. "The boys are too young to manage this property properly," Nathan continued. "The fields need to be worked, decisions need to be made. I'll be taking over the management of everything until they come of age." Sarah nodded. This was expected, legal, proper. Nathan was the nearest adult male relative. Of course he would manage her son's inheritance. But, Nathan added, and this was where Sarah's heart began to sink, "I can't have you and the boys living here while I'm trying to work the land. Too many mouths to feed, too much disruption. You'll need to find somewhere else to go." Somewhere else? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "But this is our home. These are my children's rightful inheritance." Nathan shrugged. "The inheritance is the land, the house, the livestock, not room and board for every widow and orphan. I'll make sure the boys get their share when they're old enough to claim it. But until then, you'll have to make your own arrangements." And there it was, the moment that transformed Sarah from a woman with a place in the world to a woman with nothing. Legally, Nathan was within his rights. Morally, he was abandoning a sister-in-law and her children to destitution. But in biblical times, legal rights trumped moral obligations, especially when it came to women. Sarah had 3 days to pack her belongings and leave the only home she had known as an adult. But where could she go? That's the question that haunts every widow's story in biblical times. Where do you go when you have no legal rights, no economic resources, no male relatives willing to take you in? Some widows were fortunate. They had fathers still living who might take them back into the family home. But Sarah's father had died years earlier, and her mother had remarried. Her stepfather had no legal obligation to support her, and frankly, no desire to take on the burden of feeding another mouth. Some widows had grown sons who honored their obligation to care for their mothers, but Sarah's sons were children, dependent on her rather than capable of protecting her. Some widows had wealthy relatives who might offer charity, but Sarah's family was poor. Everyone was struggling to survive, which left Sarah with the options available to most widows in biblical times: begging, prostitution, or starvation. Let that sink in for a moment. In a society that claimed to honor women as mothers and wives, in a culture that spoke constantly of God's love and justice, the most vulnerable women were left with choices that would destroy either their bodies or their souls. Sarah stood in the doorway of what had been her home, holding her few possessions in a worn cloth bundle. Her sons flanked her, confusion and fear written across their young faces. The youngest, David, kept asking when they could go back inside. Sarah had no answer for him. The first night they slept under the stars just outside the village walls. Sarah wrapped her boys in the one blanket she'd been allowed to take, listening to them whimper from hunger and cold. She lay awake, staring up at the same constellations that had shone down on her grandmother, her great-grandmother, countless generations of women who had faced this same impossible situation. By dawn, Sarah understood something that no amount of teaching or preparation could have conveyed. Being a widow in biblical times wasn't just difficult. It was a form of social death that left you breathing. The next morning brought their first encounter with the harsh economics of widowhood. Sarah approached the village baker, a man who had known her family for years, who had bought grain from Eli's fields, who had nodded respectfully to her at the well countless times. "Please," she said quietly, aware that her sons were listening, "could you spare some bread? Just until I can find work, find some way to provide for my children." The baker looked uncomfortable. Not cruel, not heartless, just practical. "Sarah, I wish I could help. But if I give bread to every widow, every orphan, I'll be joining you in the streets. I have my own family to feed." So, this was the brutal mathematics of ancient life. Everyone lived so close to the edge of survival that charity, however well-intentioned, was a luxury most couldn't afford. There was no social safety net, no government assistance, no charitable organizations with steady funding. Help, when it came at all, came sporadically, grudgingly, and never enough. Sarah tried the other merchants, the other farmers, anyone who might need an extra pair of hands. But here she discovered another cruel reality of widowhood. A woman working alone, without male protection, was viewed with suspicion. Was she desperate enough to steal? Was she so hungry she might contaminate food with her uncleanness? Most importantly, what respectable man wanted to be seen alone with a widow, risking whispers about his own moral character? The few jobs available to women, grinding grain, spinning wool, helping with harvests, were already filled by women with male relatives vouching for them. Sarah had no such protection. She was a legal ghost, invisible to the economic systems that kept society functioning. Days passed, then weeks. Sarah's small bundle of possessions dwindled as she traded her wedding jewelry, her extra clothing, anything of value for scraps of food. Her sons grew thinner, quieter. The bright curiosity that had once lit their eyes began to fade, replaced by the dull acceptance that comes with chronic hunger. They slept wherever they could find shelter, sometimes in the corners of olive groves, sometimes in caves outside the city walls, sometimes in the doorways of houses whose owners hadn't yet chased them away. Sarah learned to wake at the slightest sound, always ready to grab her children and run if someone decided they were too close to private property. The physical degradation was horrible enough. Sarah's hands, once soft from tending her own household, became cracked and bleeding from scavenging for roots and berries. Her back ached from sleeping on stone and hard earth, Her feet developed sores from walking endless distances in search of work, food, shelter. But the psychological assault was worse. Every day brought new humiliations, new reminders of her worthlessness in the eyes of society. Children threw stones at her and her sons, calling them beggars, outcasts. Women she had once called neighbours averted their eyes when they passed, afraid that acknowledging her might somehow invite the same fate upon themselves. Men looked at her differently now, not with the respectful distance they had shown when she was Eli's wife, but with a calculating gaze that made her skin crawl. She began to understand why desperation drove so many widows to prostitution. It wasn't moral failing. It was the simple equation of survival when society offered no other options. One evening, as Sarah huddled with her sons in an abandoned sheep pen, listening to their stomachs growl, she finally understood the true horror of her situation. It wasn't just that she was poor. It wasn't just that she was hungry. It was that she had become invisible to the moral universe that supposedly governed her society. The same religious laws that commanded kindness to orphans and widows, the same cultural values that praised feminine virtue and maternal devotion, somehow evaporated when faced with the actual reality of a woman in need. Charity was praised in theory, but avoided in practice. Justice was proclaimed from every temple, but denied in every marketplace. Sarah began to see other widows, women she hadn't noticed before because they occupied the shadowy margins of village life. There was Rebecca, whose husband had died in a farming accident, now reduced to gleaning in fields after harvest, picking up the scattered grains that the workers had missed. There was Miriam, who had lost her husband to fever and now sold her few remaining possessions one by one, each transaction bringing her closer to complete destitution. These women had once been wives, mothers, respected members of their communities. Now they were cautionary tales, warnings of what happened when the protective structure of marriage collapsed. They moved like ghosts through a world that had once embraced them, seeking the scraps of life that others discarded. The children suffered most. Sarah watched her sons' personalities change as hunger and insecurity took their toll. David, once cheerful and talkative, became withdrawn and suspicious. Samuel, her elder son, began disappearing for hours, returning with food he claimed to have found, but which Sarah suspected he had stolen. She couldn't bring herself to scold him. When your children are starving, moral absolutes become luxuries you can't afford. Winter approached, and with it, the knowledge that survival would become even more precarious. The casual charity of harvest time, when extra grain might be shared, would disappear. The outdoor sleeping that was merely uncomfortable in warm weather would become potentially fatal in the cold months ahead. It was then that Sarah made the most difficult decision of her life. She sought out Nathan, her brother-in-law, the man who had evicted her from her home and claimed her son's inheritance. She found him in the marketplace, examining pottery with the leisurely air of a man whose next meal was guaranteed. When he saw her approaching, his expression hardened with embarrassment and irritation. "Nathan," she said, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "My sons are starving." He glanced around, uncomfortable with the public nature of this conversation. "That's unfortunate, Sarah. But I told you I can't support every—" "They are your brother's sons," she interrupted, a breach of etiquette that would have been unthinkable in her former life. "They are your blood, and they are dying." Nathan's jaw tightened. Around them, other merchants and shoppers were beginning to notice the exchange. In a small community, family disputes conducted in public reflected poorly on everyone involved. "What do you want from me?" he asked quietly. "Take the boys," Sarah said, the words feeling like broken glass in her throat. "Let them work your fields in exchange for food and shelter. They're old enough to be useful. And you?" Sarah looked at her sons, who stood behind her like small, frightened shadows of the children they had once been. I'll find my own way. This was the final cruelty of widowhood in biblical times. Even when family members were willing to help, their assistance often came with conditions that would tear the family apart. Nathan might take the boys, but only as unpaid laborers. They would grow up as servants in what should have been their own home, and Sarah would lose the only reason she had for continuing to fight. Nathan considered the offer: 2 strong boys to help with the harvest, to tend the flocks, to do the dangerous work that might otherwise require hired hands. It was, from his perspective, a reasonable business proposition. "Very well," he said finally, "but I won't have them treated as family. They'll work for their keep, nothing more. And if they cause trouble, out they go." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. She had just negotiated away her children's birthright and her own purpose for existing. But she had also ensured that they would eat, that they would survive, that they might grow to adulthood with some chance of escaping the cycle of poverty that had trapped her. That night, she held her sons close for what she knew would be the last time. Tomorrow, they would go to Nathan's house, and she would walk away from the only life that had ever made sense to her. She would become what every widow in biblical times feared most: a woman completely alone in a world that had no place for her. The boys cried, begged her to come with them, promised they would take care of her somehow. But Sarah knew better. She had learned the hard arithmetic of survival. 2 extra mouths to feed might be manageable. 3 was too many. Someone had to be sacrificed, and it couldn't be the children. As dawn broke, Sarah walked her sons to Nathan's door. She kissed their foreheads, whispered blessings she wasn't sure she believed anymore, and turned away before her resolve could crumble. Behind her, she heard David calling her name, but she didn't look back. Looking back would have killed her, and so Sarah joined the ranks of the utterly dispossessed, the women who existed in the cracks between civilized society. She learned to scavenge, to beg without seeming to beg, to make herself invisible when survival required it. She discovered that hunger was a constant companion, but that the human body could endure more deprivation than she had ever imagined. She found the other lost women, the widows and abandoned daughters, who formed a shadow community on the margins of respectable society. They shared information about which households might have scraps to spare, which roads were safe to travel, which villages showed more tolerance for their kind. They warned each other about men who preyed on desperate women, about places where the welcome came with prices too high to pay. This was the reality behind the biblical commandments to care for widows and orphans. The laws existed precisely because the natural human tendency was to ignore them, to let them fade away into the background, where their suffering wouldn't disturb the comfortable order of family life. The repeated injunctions to remember the widow, to defend the orphan, to show justice to the powerless were necessary because these things didn't happen naturally. Most people weren't evil. They simply lived in a world where resources were scarce, and survival required focusing on your own family first. The widow next door, the orphaned children down the street, they were someone else's responsibility. Everyone thought this way, which meant they were no one's responsibility. Sarah learned to read the subtle signs that determined whether a day would bring a small kindness or another closed door. A woman hanging laundry might have scraps of bread to spare if her own children were well fed. A farmer loading grain might drop a few stalks accidentally if no one else was watching. A merchant might overlook a small item missing from his stall if the theft was desperate rather than greedy. These tiny mercies kept her alive, but they also kept her trapped in an existence that was barely worthy of the name. She was surviving, but not living, breathing, but not hoping. Each day was a repetition of the same desperate calculations: where to find food, where to find shelter, how to stay invisible enough to avoid trouble but visible enough to receive the occasional act of charity. Months turned to seasons, and seasons to years. Sarah's reflection, glimpsed occasionally in still water, showed a woman she no longer recognized. Her hair, once carefully braided and oiled, hung in matted strands. Her skin, weathered by sun and wind, bore the permanent marks of malnutrition. Her eyes, once bright with the simple contentments of domestic life, had taken on the hollow look of someone who had seen too much and hoped too little. But perhaps most devastating was the way she had learned to think. Where once she had planned meals for the week ahead, now she thought only in terms of hours. Where to sleep tonight? What to eat before sunset? How to avoid the groups of young men who sometimes amused themselves by chasing beggars through the streets. She discovered that destitution had its own terrible education. She learned which houses threw out their scraps at which times of day. She learned to recognize the difference between genuine kindness and the sort of charity that came with expectations she couldn't meet. She learned to distinguish between the footsteps of someone who might help and someone who might harm. Most painfully, she learned to forget. Not the faces of her children, never those, but the feeling of safety that had once defined her world. The memory of waking up in her own bed, knowing where her next meal would come from, confident that tomorrow would be much like today. That kind of security became as foreign to her as the palaces of kings. Winter came with its particular cruelties. The olive groves where she sometimes sheltered offered no protection from the rain that turned the dusty ground into treacherous mud. The caves outside town, while dry, filled quickly with other desperate souls, and the competition for space sometimes turned violent. Sarah learned to sleep lightly, always ready to flee if the wrong kind of person discovered her hiding place. Food became even scarcer during the cold months. The fruits and wild plants that supplemented her meager diet disappeared. The farmers who might occasionally offer work during harvest season had no need for extra hands. Even begging became more difficult as people hurried past with heads down, focused on their own survival through the harsh weather. It was during this first winter of her widowhood that Sarah encountered something that would stay with her forever. She was huddled in the doorway of a grain storage building, trying to stay out of the wind, when she heard crying. Not the angry wailing of a child having a tantrum, but the weak, persistent whimpering of genuine distress. In the shadows across the narrow street, she saw another woman, older than herself, cradling what appeared to be a bundle of rags. As Sarah's eyes adjusted to the darkness, she realized the bundle was moving. It was a baby, and from the sound of its cries, it was dying. The woman looked up and met Sarah's eyes. In that moment, no words were needed. Here was another widow, another woman who had fallen through the cracks of society's protective structures. But this one had an infant to care for, and she was losing the battle. Sarah had nothing to give. Her own stomach was empty, her own body weak from hunger and exposure. But she found herself crossing the street, sitting down beside this stranger, offering the only thing she had left, her presence. The woman's name was Hannah. Her husband had died in a construction accident just 3 months after their first child was born. Like Sarah, she had found herself suddenly invisible to the legal system that had once protected her. Unlike Sarah, she had no children old enough to be placed with relatives. She had been trying to nurse a baby while slowly starving to death. "I have no milk left," Hannah whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I haven't eaten in 4 days. She's dying, and I can't save her." Sarah looked at the tiny face peeking out from the tattered blankets. The baby's skin had the waxy pallor of severe malnutrition. Her breathing was shallow and irregular. Even someone with no medical training could see that death was near. What happened next would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. Hannah looked at her with eyes that held no hope, only the terrible clarity that comes when all illusions have been stripped away. "Will you stay with us?" Hannah asked. "I don't want her to die alone." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. She sat there in the cold doorway, watching a mother hold her dying child, and finally understood the full scope of what widowhood meant in biblical times. It wasn't just poverty. It wasn't just social isolation. It was being pushed so far beyond the boundaries of human compassion that you could starve to death in full view of a supposedly godly community. The baby died just before dawn. Hannah held her daughter's still form for a long time, rocking gently, humming a lullaby that no one would ever hear again. Then she looked at Sarah with a strange sort of peace. "Thank you," she said simply. "No one should have to face this alone." Hannah disappeared the next day. Sarah never learned what became of her, but she suspected. When you have nothing left to live for, when even the basic bonds of motherhood have been severed by circumstance beyond your control, the final step into non-existence might seem like mercy rather than tragedy. This encounter changed something fundamental in Sarah's understanding of her situation. She had thought her suffering was about her personal loss, her individual tragedy. But Hannah's story revealed the systematic nature of the problem. This wasn't bad luck or divine punishment or moral failing. This was how the system worked. This was what happened to women when the structures that protected them collapsed. She began to notice things she had been too consumed with her own survival to see before. The other widows weren't isolated cases of misfortune. They were everywhere once you knew how to look. They were the women who appeared at the city gates at dawn, hoping to glean leftover grain from the merchant stalls. They were the figures who moved through the shadows after dark, searching for scraps in the refuse piles behind prosperous houses. Some had been beautiful once. Some had been wealthy. Some had been pious. Faithful wives who had followed every religious law, observed every ritual, trusted that their devotion would be rewarded. Now they were all the same, invisible, expendable, forgotten. Sarah also began to understand the complicated mathematics of charity in biblical times. It wasn't that people were inherently cruel or selfish. It was that helping a widow often meant taking resources away from your own family's survival. In a world where everyone lived so close to the edge of disaster, genuine charity was a luxury most couldn't afford. The religious leaders spoke beautifully about caring for widows and orphans. They quoted scriptures about justice and compassion. But when it came to practical support, to actually sharing resources that might mean the difference between their own family's comfort and hardship, the sermons remained just words. There were exceptions, of course. Sarah occasionally encountered genuine kindness, people who shared their food despite having little to spare. But these acts of mercy were rare enough to be memorable, bright moments in a landscape of general indifference. More common were the conditional offers of help. The merchant who would give her bread in exchange for work that no respectable woman should have to do. The farmers who offered shelter for the night with expectations that made her skin crawl. The religious authorities who spoke of charity while carefully avoiding eye contact with the desperate women who gathered outside their buildings. Sarah learned to navigate these moral minefields with the skill of someone whose life depended on reading people's true intentions. She developed an instinct for recognizing help that came with hidden costs, kindness that was actually predation in disguise. Survival required becoming expert at distinguishing between genuine compassion and the kind of assistance that would destroy whatever remained of her dignity. As months passed, she found herself forgetting things that had once seemed essential to her identity. The prayers she had said daily as a wife and mother began to slip from her memory. The rituals that had marked the rhythm of her former life, the Sabbath observances, the festival preparations, the careful attention to dietary laws, all of these faded into irrelevance when simply staying alive required all her energy. This spiritual erosion was perhaps the cruelest aspect of her situation. In a society where religious observance defined not just personal identity, but social belonging, becoming too desperate to maintain proper worship meant losing connection to the community of faith that was supposed to provide comfort in times of suffering. Sarah couldn't afford to rest on the Sabbath when resting meant going hungry. She couldn't maintain ritual purity when she had no access to the necessary facilities for washing. She couldn't observe the dietary laws when any food, regardless of its source or preparation, was a gift to be grateful for. Gradually, she found herself existing outside not just the social structures that had once protected her, but outside the religious framework that had once given meaning to her suffering. She was too poor to be pious, too desperate to be devout. Yet something unexpected happened in this spiritual wilderness. Stripped of formal religious observance, Sarah began to develop a different kind of relationship with the divine. Not the ritualized worship of her former life, but something more raw, more honest, more essential. Her prayers, when they came, were not the careful formulas she had learned as a child. They were wordless cries of anguish, desperate pleas for strength to make it through another day, quiet moments of gratitude for the smallest mercies. She found herself talking to God, not as a distant authority to be appeased with correct behavior, but as the only witness to suffering that no one else seemed to see. This transformation was both liberation and loss. She had found a more authentic spiritual connection, but at the cost of everything else that had once made life worth living. It was like discovering a hidden room in your house just as the rest of the building burned down around you. Years passed this way. Sarah aged rapidly under the constant stress of survival. Her hair turned grey, her back curved from sleeping on hard ground. Her hands became permanently stained and scarred from the desperate work of scavenging. She looked like what she was, a woman who had been ground down by circumstances beyond her control. But she survived. Day after day, season after season, she found ways to keep breathing, keep moving, keep hoping for something better even when hope seemed pointless. She learned skills she never imagined needing: how to find edible roots in winter, how to treat wounds with wild herbs, how to disappear when danger approached. More importantly, she learned things about human nature that her protected life as a wife had never revealed. She discovered that kindness often came from the most unexpected sources: the prostitute who shared her meager earnings with hungry children, the tax collector who accidentally dropped coins where desperate people might find them, the foreign merchant who didn't understand local customs but understood hunger. She also learned that cruelty was most often casual rather than intentional. People didn't set out to harm widows and orphans. They simply lived their lives without thinking about the consequences for those who existed at the margins. The evil wasn't dramatic or deliberate. It was quiet, systemic, woven into the fabric of daily life so thoroughly that most people never noticed it. Occasionally, Sarah would catch glimpses of her sons. They were growing up in Nathan's household, learning to work the land that should have been theirs by right. They looked healthy, well-fed, but there was something in their eyes that broke her heart. The easy confidence of childhood was gone, replaced by the careful watchfulness of children who understood their place in the world was precarious. David, her youngest, sometimes looked in her direction when she passed through the market. She could see recognition in his face, but also confusion, and something that might have been shame. He had been taught, no doubt, that his mother was a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when women didn't properly secure their place in society. Samuel, her elder son, had learned not to look at all. He kept his eyes down when he accompanied Nathan to the market, focusing intently on his tasks, pretending not to see the ragged woman who watched him from the shadows. Sarah understood. Acknowledging her would only make his own situation more difficult. This was perhaps the deepest cut of all. Her sacrifice to ensure her children's survival had succeeded, but at the cost of any relationship with them. They were alive, but she was dead to them. She had traded her place in their hearts for their place at Nathan's table. And while it had been the right choice, it left her more alone than she had ever imagined possible. Sometimes she wondered if Eli could see her now, if the dead were aware of what happened to those they left behind. Would he be proud of her sacrifice for their sons? Would he be horrified by what she had been reduced to? Would he understand that she had done everything she could to honor his memory and protect his children, even when it meant destroying herself? These questions had no answers, but they occupied the long hours when sleep wouldn't come, when hunger made rest impossible, when the weight of her choices pressed down like a physical burden. She had survived longer than many widows did, but survival alone was not enough to make life meaningful. And yet, in the depths of this seemingly hopeless existence, Sarah began to understand something that would have been impossible to grasp during her comfortable years as a wife. She began to see the invisible networks of support that existed among society's outcasts, the ways that people with nothing still found ways to help each other. The other widows, the abandoned women, the elderly poor, they formed a community of sorts, not a formal organization with rules and leaders, but an understanding that survival was easier when shared. Information about which households might have work, warnings about dangerous men, news about changes in local policies that might affect their precarious existence. All of this circulated through quiet conversations in back alleys and hidden corners. Sarah found herself becoming part of this shadow society, contributing what little she could to the collective knowledge that kept them all alive. She learned to read the signs that indicated whether a potential source of help was genuine or dangerous. She shared her own hard-won wisdom about which wild plants were edible, which shelters were safe, which merchants might be sympathetic to desperate requests. In this world of the dispossessed, age and beauty and former social status meant nothing. What mattered was resourcefulness, endurance, and the willingness to share whatever small advantages you might gain. Sarah discovered that she was good at this. The same skills that had made her an effective household manager, the ability to plan and organize and anticipate problems, served her well in the complex business of survival. She became someone other desperate women sought out for advice. Not a leader exactly, but a resource. Someone whose experience might help others navigate the treacherous waters of destitution. This gave her life a purpose she hadn't expected to find. A reason to keep going beyond mere stubborn refusal to die. But even as Sarah found ways to create meaning in her reduced circumstances, the fundamental injustice of her situation never stopped burning in her chest. She had done everything right, according to the standards of her society. She had been a faithful wife, a devoted mother, an observant believer. She had followed all the rules, met all the expectations, fulfilled all the roles that women were supposed to embrace. And when the system failed her, when the structures that were supposed to protect the righteous collapsed, she discovered that righteousness itself was a luxury she could no longer afford. The world didn't care about her virtue or her faithfulness or her years of service to family and community. When she became inconvenient, she simply ceased to matter. This realization was more bitter than hunger, more painful than physical hardship. It stripped away the last illusions about justice and fairness that had sustained her through the early months of widowhood. The universe, she learned, was not moral, it was merely indifferent. Yet somehow, in accepting this terrible truth, Sarah found a strange kind of peace. If the world was indifferent, then her survival was entirely up to her. She was not being tested by God, or punished for hidden sins, or rewarded for past virtue. She was simply a human being in difficult circumstances, doing what humans do, adapting, enduring, finding ways to keep going, even when keeping going seemed pointless. This acceptance didn't make her situation easier, but it made it more bearable. She stopped waiting for rescue, stopped hoping for justice, stopped expecting the community that had abandoned her to suddenly develop a conscience. Instead, she focused on the things she could control. Her own choices, her own responses, her own determination to survive with whatever dignity remained possible. Winter came again, her third as a widow, and with it, the familiar challenges of staying warm and fed when resources were scarce. But this time, Sarah was better prepared. She had learned the rhythms of seasonal charity, knew which families might have extra blankets to spare, understood how to position herself for the occasional acts of mercy that punctuated the general indifference. She had also learned something more important: how to find warmth in unexpected places. The community of outcasts, the invisible network of desperate women, provided a kind of companionship that her former life had never offered. These relationships weren't based on social status or family connections or shared prosperity. They were based on shared understanding of what it meant to be discarded by the world. In the doorways and hidden corners where society's refugees gathered, Sarah found conversations that were more honest than any she had experienced as a respectable wife. There was no pretense among the dispossessed, no need to maintain illusions about the fairness of life or the reliability of human kindness. They talked about survival, about loss, about the small victories that made another day possible. These women had stories that would have been unimaginable during Sarah's protected years. The daughter thrown out by her family when her husband died in debt. The mother who chose prostitution over watching her children starve. The elderly woman whose own sons had decided she was too expensive to care for in her declining years. Each story was a variation on the same theme: what happened to women when the systems designed to protect them failed? And listening to these stories, Sarah began to understand that her own suffering was not unique or exceptional. It was routine, predictable, woven into the very fabric of how society functioned. This knowledge was both devastating and oddly comforting. Devastating because it revealed the scope of the injustice she was experiencing. Comforting because it meant her situation wasn't the result of personal failure or divine displeasure. She was simply caught in a system that had no place for women without male protectors. As winter deepened and the cold bit harder, Sarah found herself thinking not about her own survival, but about the younger women who were just beginning to experience widowhood. The newly bereaved who still believed that community support would materialize, that family obligations would be honored, that faith and virtue would somehow provide protection against destitution. She began to understand that her survival, her stubborn refusal to disappear quietly into death, had become a form of witness. Every day she continued to exist was proof that the system was failing, that the religious teachings about caring for widows were empty words, that the community's claims about justice and compassion were lies told to make people feel better about their own comfort. This realization gave her suffering a meaning she hadn't expected. She wasn't just enduring for her own sake anymore. She was enduring as testimony to the experiences of all the women who hadn't survived, whose stories had died with them, whose voices had been silenced by hunger and cold and despair. The widow in biblical times, Sarah now understood, wasn't just a victim of unfortunate circumstances. She was a living indictment of everything her society claimed to believe about morality, community, and divine justice. Her very existence challenged the comfortable assumptions that allowed people to sleep peacefully while their neighbors suffered. And so she continued, one day at a time, one breath at a time, carrying not just her own story, but the stories of all the forgotten women whose lives had been ground up by the same merciless machinery of social indifference. She had become more than just Sarah the potter's daughter, more than just Eli's widow. She had become something her former life could never have prepared her for, a witness to the gap between what people said they believed and how they actually lived. And in that role, in that terrible, necessary purpose, she found reasons to keep going that had nothing to do with hope and everything to do with truth. The years blurred together in a way that time does when survival becomes the only measure of success. Sarah's fourth winter as a widow arrived with the cruel predictability of seasons that no longer brought joy, only different forms of hardship. But something had shifted in her understanding of her place in the world, something that would have been impossible to grasp during her comfortable years as Eli's wife. She had learned to read the subtle language of desperation that passed between women in the market squares. A glance held too long, a pause at a merchant's stall, the way someone's hand lingered on a loaf of bread they couldn't afford. These tiny signals formed a communication system invisible to the comfortable, a network of understanding between those who lived in the spaces society pretended didn't exist. There was Rebecca, the young woman whose husband had died in a building collapse just 6 months after their wedding. Rebecca still carried herself with the bewildered dignity of someone who hadn't yet accepted that her former life was gone forever. She would approach merchants with the expectation of credit, still believing that her reputation as a good woman would somehow translate into practical help. Sarah watched Rebecca make the same mistakes she had made years earlier. The assumption that past respectability would provide current protection. The belief that if she just explained her situation properly, someone would surely help. The crushing discovery that tragedy, however blameless, was viewed as contagious by those who feared it might touch their own lives. "She'll learn," said Miriam, an older widow who had been living rough for nearly a decade. Miriam's voice carried the flat acceptance of someone who had exhausted her capacity for outrage. They all learn, the ones who live long enough. Sarah found herself becoming something she had never expected, a teacher. Not formally, not officially, but in the quiet way that knowledge passes between people who share the same impossible circumstances. She taught the newly widowed how to make themselves small and invisible when necessary, how to approach potential sources of help without triggering the defensive anger that requests for charity often provoked. She showed them which wild plants could supplement a meager diet, which doorways provided shelter from both weather and unwanted attention. More importantly, she taught them how to preserve some sense of self when the world insisted they were nothing more than burdens to be discarded. "The hardest part," she told Rebecca one evening as they sheltered in an abandoned storage shed, "isn't the hunger. It isn't even the cold. It's learning to see yourself as human when everyone else has stopped." Rebecca's eyes were still bright with tears that would eventually dry up, as Sarah's had years ago. "I keep thinking someone will remember that I was David's wife, that I helped my neighbors, that I never missed a holy day. Surely that counts for something." Sarah felt a familiar ache in her chest, the pain of watching someone else discover the truth she had learned so slowly and so completely. "It counts," she said gently, "but not in the way you think it should." This was perhaps the cruelest education of widowhood. Learning that virtue and faithfulness were luxuries that existed only within the protective structure of marriage and family. Once those structures collapsed, moral character became irrelevant to survival. The world didn't care if you had been good. It only cared whether you were useful. Winter deepened, and with it came the familiar arithmetic of desperation. How many days could you go without eating before your body began consuming itself? How cold could you get before permanent damage set in? How much pride could you swallow before you lost the will to continue entirely? Sarah had become expert at these calculations, but watching younger women learn them was almost unbearable. She saw herself in their faces, remembered the shock of discovering that the safety she had taken for granted was an illusion that could vanish in a single night. There was something else she was learning, though, something that surprised her. The community of discarded women had developed its own forms of wealth, its own systems of value that operated entirely outside the economic structures that had failed them. Information was currency. Knowing which household had recently suffered a death might mean knowing where mourning customs would require the distribution of food to the poor. Understanding the seasonal patterns of different trades could reveal opportunities for temporary work. Recognizing the signs of a merchant's good mood might mean the difference between charity and rejection. Reputation mattered too, but not in the way it had during Sarah's respectable years. Among the desperate, your reputation was built on reliability in small things. Did you share information that might help others survive? Could you be trusted not to betray a hiding place or a source of food? Would you help another woman in crisis, even when you had nothing to spare? Sarah discovered she was wealthy in this shadow economy. Her years of experience had taught her to read situations, to assess risks, to find resources where others saw only emptiness. Younger widows sought her advice, and older ones respected her judgment. She had become a person of influence in a world that officially didn't exist. But this influence came with responsibilities that sometimes felt heavier than her former powerlessness. When Rebecca was approached by a merchant who offered steady work in exchange for services no respectable woman should provide, she came to Sarah for guidance. "I have children," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're staying with my sister, but she can't keep them much longer. She has her own family to feed." Sarah looked at this young woman, still beautiful despite the hardships, still clinging to the moral framework that had once defined her world. The choice Rebecca faced was one that countless widows had confronted: preserve your virtue and watch your children starve, or sacrifice your soul to keep them alive. "There are other ways," Sarah said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew how hollow they sounded. The other ways were harder, less reliable, offered no guarantee of success. "What other ways?" Rebecca's question carried the edge of desperation that Sarah recognized in her own voice from years past. "I've tried everything. No one will hire a woman without a man to vouch for her. The work that is available pays barely enough to keep one person alive, let alone 3. Sarah spent the night staring at the stars through a crack in the roof, thinking about the mathematics of moral choice. In her comfortable years as a wife, virtue had been easy. When your basic needs were met, when your security was guaranteed, maintaining proper behavior required no sacrifice. But when virtue meant watching your children die, when righteousness translated to letting your family disintegrate, the moral equations became infinitely more complex. Sarah had been fortunate in a terrible way. By the time she faced these impossible choices, she had already lost her children to Nathan's household. She had only herself to preserve or destroy. Rebecca had no such luxury of simplified decision-making. The next morning, Sarah made a choice that would have been unthinkable during her respectable years. She sought out the merchant who had propositioned Rebecca, not to negotiate on the young woman's behalf, but to make a different kind of arrangement. "The girl has children," she told him bluntly. "She's not suited for the work you have in mind. But I know other women who might be interested. Women without family obligations, women who've already lost everything they had to lose." The merchant, a middle-aged man whose wealth had insulated him from the desperate calculations that governed Sarah's world, looked uncomfortable. "I'm not running a charitable organization," he said defensively. "I need someone reliable, someone who won't cause complications." "And you'll get that," Sarah replied, "but not from someone who still has something left to sacrifice. You want a woman with no illusions, no competing loyalties, no hope for redemption. I can arrange that." It was a conversation that would have horrified the woman Sarah had once been. She was negotiating for prostitution, facilitating the very degradation that respectable society claimed to abhor. But respectability, she had learned, was a luxury available only to those with other options. The arrangement she negotiated wasn't for Rebecca, who managed to find temporary work helping with a difficult birth that led to more midwifery opportunities. It was for Hannah, a different Hannah than the one who had died holding her baby, an older woman whose husband had been killed in a border skirmish and whose grown children lived too far away to help. This Hannah had already made the choice that Rebecca had been spared. She had already crossed the line that separated the unfortunate from the fallen. Sarah's negotiation simply ensured she would be treated with some measure of dignity, paid fairly, and protected from the worst abuses that often accompanied such arrangements. Sarah never asked Hannah how she felt about the work, and Hannah never volunteered the information. They both understood that some choices existed beyond the realm of moral judgment. in a space where survival itself was the only virtue that mattered. But the weight of that negotiation, of becoming someone who facilitated what she had once considered unthinkable, settled into Sarah's bones like winter cold. She was changing in ways that her former self wouldn't have recognized, becoming someone adapted to a world that operated by rules she was still learning. Spring arrived with its false promises of renewal. The weather warmed, making outdoor survival less perilous, but also bringing the restlessness that came with the memory of better times. Sarah found herself standing in the market square where she had once shopped as Eli's wife, watching the familiar rhythms of normal life continue around her, as if her fall from respectability had never happened. The baker who had refused her bread 3 years ago still called out his wares to passing customers. The fabric seller who had averted her eyes when Sarah begged for scraps still displayed her colourful wares with pride. The neighbour women, who had once exchanged gossip with her at the well, still gathered in small groups, their conversations punctuated by the same laughter that had once included her voice. None of them looked in her direction. She had become invisible, not through any magical transformation, but through the simple expedient of falling below the threshold of social relevance. Her former neighbours didn't avoid her out of cruelty. They simply didn't see her anymore. This invisibility was both protection and torment. It allowed her to move through spaces that might otherwise be denied to someone of her reduced status. But it also meant that her suffering, however acute, registered with no one who might have power to address it. She watched a young woman, probably not much older than she had been when she married Eli, haggling with a merchant over the price of olive oil. The woman's husband stood behind her, occasionally interjecting when the negotiation grew heated. Their children played at their feet, secure in the knowledge that they belonged somewhere, that they were protected by the invisible but powerful bonds of family and community. Sarah remembered being that woman. She remembered the casual confidence that came with knowing your place in the world was secure, that tomorrow would arrive with familiar routines and reliable comforts. She remembered complaining about trivial inconveniences, never imagining that inconvenience itself was a luxury available only to those whose basic survival was guaranteed. The memory wasn't bitter, exactly. It was more like looking at a painting of someone else's life, beautiful but entirely disconnected from her current reality. That woman, Eli's wife, Sarah the potter's daughter, had died as surely as if she had been buried alongside her husband. What remained was something else entirely, something adapted to circumstances that earlier version of herself could never have imagined surviving. As she stood there, invisible among the crowd of people going about their normal lives, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. A strange kind of peace. Not happiness, not contentment, but the quiet satisfaction that comes from understanding your situation completely and no longer fighting against what cannot be changed. She had learned to live in the margins, to find meaning in the spaces between other people's stories. She had discovered forms of wealth that couldn't be measured in silver or property, types of influence that operated outside the official structures of power. She had become someone who mattered in ways that the comfortable world would never recognize or understand. The sun was setting, painting the market square in the golden light that made even the humblest activities seem touched by divine presence. Sarah gathered her threadbare cloak around her shoulders and prepared to return to whatever shelter she could find for the night. As she turned to leave, she noticed a young woman sitting alone beside a pile of pottery, her face streaked with tears. The woman's clothing marked her as recently married, but something in her posture suggested that marriage might no longer be her reality. Sarah paused, recognizing the signs she had learned to read so well. The careful way the woman held herself, as if trying to take up as little space as possible. The way her eyes tracked the movements of passers-by without quite meeting anyone's gaze. The protective curve of her shoulders around a belly that might or might not be carrying new life. Another widow. Another woman about to discover what it meant to fall through the cracks of society's protective structures. Sarah approached slowly, careful not to startle someone who was clearly already frightened. "Sister," she said quietly, using the term that had become common among the desperate women who formed their own informal community. "Are you alone?" The young woman looked up, and Sarah saw her own story reflected in those frightened eyes. The confusion, the disbelief, the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, would offer the help that logic said wasn't coming. "My husband died last week," the woman whispered. "Fever. His family says I can't stay in the house. They need it for his brother's family. I don't know where to go." Sarah sat down beside her, remembering her own first night outside the walls of respectability. "What's your name?" "Ruth." "I'm Sarah, and you're not alone anymore." The words carried weight that went beyond simple comfort. In the shadow world of discarded women, saying, "You're not alone," was a commitment, a promise to share whatever meager resources existed to include someone in the networks of information and mutual aid that made survival possible. Ruth began to cry, not the controlled weeping of public mourning, but the raw sobs of someone who had been holding terror inside for too long. Sarah didn't offer empty reassurances about things getting better, or divine providence providing solutions. Instead, she offered something more valuable, the knowledge that it was possible to survive what seemed unsurvivable. "The first thing you need to know," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of hard-won experience, "is that everything you think you understand about how the world works is about to change. The people you thought would help you won't. The systems you believed would protect you don't exist for women like us. But there are other systems, other people, other ways to live." As darkness settled over the market square, Sarah began Ruth's education in the realities of widowhood. It would be a harsh curriculum, but one that might mean the difference between survival and joining the countless women whose stories ended in unmarked graves. The cycle was beginning again, but this time Sarah was the teacher rather than the student. She had become what she had once needed, someone who understood, someone who had found a way to endure, someone who could pass on the terrible wisdom that kept discarded women breathing in a world that had no use for them. In the growing darkness, two women sat beside unsold pottery, planning for a future that would offer no guarantees except this. They would face it together, drawing strength from the only source that had never failed them, the stubborn refusal of human beings to disappear quietly into despair. The night was quiet now, the kind of quiet that settles over stories that have no easy endings, only the promise of another day and another choice between surrender and endurance. Sarah had made her choice long ago, and now she was helping others make theirs. In the margins of biblical society, where the official histories never looked, women like Sarah and Ruth were writing their own scripture of survival, one whispered conversation at a time. But survival, as Sarah had learned, was only the first step. Living required something more, something that went beyond the basic calculations of food and shelter. It required understanding how the world really worked beneath the surface of religious teachings and moral pronouncements. Ruth's education began with the hardest lesson of all. Trust was a luxury she could no longer afford, especially when it came from men who offered help with conditions unspoken but understood. Sarah had learned this truth through bitter experience, watching other desperate women disappear into arrangements that promised security but delivered only different forms of degradation. "There are men who hunt women like us," Sarah explained as they huddled in an abandoned grain storage building, listening to the wind whistle through gaps in the stone walls. "They smell desperation like wolves smell blood. They offer work, shelter, protection, but the price they expect isn't always spoken aloud." Ruth's eyes widened with a kind of innocence that Sarah remembered losing years ago. "But surely not all men. The priests teach about caring for widows, about justice for the fatherless." Sarah's laugh was dry as desert sand. "The priests teach many things from their comfortable temples. But when did you last see one of them sharing his meal with a hungry widow?" When did you last hear of a priest offering his own home to a woman with nowhere to go? This was the education that no young wife ever received, the knowledge that was only gained through falling out of society's protective embrace. The religious authorities, who spoke so eloquently about divine compassion, somehow never translated that compassion into practical help. They were excellent at explaining why suffering was part of God's plan, less skilled at alleviating it. Ruth would learn, as Sarah had, to distinguish between theoretical charity and actual assistance. She would discover that the same merchants who nodded approvingly during sermons about helping the poor would cross the street to avoid making eye contact with actual poverty. She would find that the neighbours who praised her virtue as a wife became deaf to her pleas as a widow. But there were exceptions, rare and precious as water in the desert. Sarah had learned to recognize them, the quiet ones who helped without fanfare, who shared without expecting recognition or reward. These were usually people who had themselves known loss, who understood that fate was arbitrary and circumstance could change for anyone without warning. There was old Abigail, a merchant's widow, who had managed to keep her small fabric stall through clever negotiations with her late husband's creditors. Once a month, Abigail would leave scraps of cloth in specific locations where desperate women knew to look. Never directly, never with words of charity that might embarrass the recipient, but consistently, reliably, a small act of grace in a harsh world. There was Benjamin the baker's apprentice, himself barely surviving on meagre wages, who sometimes burned loaves accidentally, leaving them in places where hungry people might find them before he reported the waste to his master. His help came with no conditions, no expectations, no need for gratitude or recognition. These people formed Sarah's true understanding of divine compassion, not the grand gestures proclaimed from temple steps, but the quiet rebellions against indifference that happened in shadows and silence. They were proof that goodness existed, but also proof of how rare and precious it was. As winter deepened, Ruth learned other lessons that no respectable woman was ever taught. How to read the signs that indicated whether a potential source of help was genuine or predatory. How to make yourself useful without making yourself vulnerable. How to preserve dignity when dignity itself seemed like an impossible luxury. She learned the geography of desperation, the invisible maps that guided those who lived outside society's protection, which corners of the market were safe to shelter in after dark, which wells were least likely to be guarded by people who would chase away the unwelcome, which roads led to villages that might be more tolerant of strangers seeking work or charity. Most importantly, she learned the difference between shame and survival. The moral categories that had once seemed absolute began to blur when filtered through the lens of actual hunger, real cold, genuine fear for one's life. Actions that would have horrified her as a respectable wife became simply choices among limited options. Sarah watched Ruth navigate these internal transformations with a mixture of sadness and pride. Sadness because she was witnessing the death of innocence, the loss of a worldview that assumed justice and mercy were reliable features of human society. Pride because Ruth was proving herself capable of the adaptations that survival required. "I never understood," Ruth said one evening as they shared a meagre meal of roots and stale bread that Sarah had bartered for with information about a merchant's missing livestock. "When I was married, when I had a home, I used to see women like us and wonder why they didn't just try harder, find work, appeal to relatives, do something to improve their situation." Sarah nodded, remembering her own former certainty that poverty was somehow a choice, that virtuous people didn't really fall into such desperate circumstances. The comfortable world teaches us that misfortune is earned, that good people are protected by their goodness. It's easier to believe that than to accept how random and cruel life really is. This was perhaps the most dangerous lie that society told itself, that virtue was rewarded and vice punished, that people got what they deserved. It allowed the comfortable to sleep peacefully, secure in the belief that their good fortune was a reflection of their moral character rather than an accident of birth and circumstance. Sarah had learned to see through this comforting fiction. She had known virtuous women who died in childbirth and cruel men who prospered. She had watched faithful wives reduced to begging while unfaithful husbands lived in comfort. The universe, she had discovered, was not a moral system, but a chaotic one, where kindness and cruelty were distributed with no regard for merit. This knowledge was liberating in its way. If suffering wasn't punishment and comfort wasn't reward, then her current circumstances reflected nothing about her worth as a person. She was not being tested by divine will or punished for hidden sins. She was simply a human being caught in circumstances beyond her control, doing what humans do, adapting, surviving, finding ways to continue. Spring came with its usual false promises of renewal. The weather warmed enough to make outdoor survival less immediately dangerous, but it also brought restlessness, the stirring of hope that was often more painful than despair. Hope required energy that survival could barely spare. Ruth had made it through her first winter as a widow, no small accomplishment in a world where many didn't survive their initial fall from respectability. She had learned the basic skills of subsistence living, developed the instincts that kept desperate people alive in a hostile environment. But she had also changed in ways that went deeper than mere survival skills. The ready smile that had once lit her face had been replaced by the careful watchfulness of someone who could no longer afford to trust appearances. The easy laughter that had punctuated her speech as a young wife had given way to the measured words of someone who understood that casual conversation could reveal vulnerabilities that others might exploit. Sarah recognized these changes because she had experienced them herself years earlier. They were the adaptations that allowed discarded women to survive, but they came at a cost. The person who emerged from the crucible of destitution was inevitably harder, more suspicious, less capable of the casual intimacies that had once made life pleasant. Yet there were compensations, forms of strength and insight that comfortable people never developed. Ruth had learned to read human nature with an accuracy that would have been impossible during her protected years as a wife. She could assess a stranger's intentions within moments of meeting them, distinguish between genuine kindness and manipulation, disguised as help. She'd also developed a capacity for gratitude that went far beyond anything she had experienced during her comfortable years. A crust of bread given freely meant more to her now than elaborate feasts had when she was married. A kind word from a stranger carried more weight than the routine affections of family had in her former life. This was one of the paradoxes of destitution. It stripped away illusions about human nature and social justice, but it also revealed the profound value of small kindnesses that privileged people took for granted. A cup of clean water, a dry place to sleep, a conversation that treated you as human rather than nuisance. These simple gifts became treasures when they could no longer be assumed. Sarah had learned to find wealth in these moments of grace, to build a life around appreciations that her comfortable years had never taught her to value. It wasn't compensation for what she had lost, but it was something, a foundation for meaning in circumstances that seemed designed to strip meaning away. As the seasons turned and Ruth's education in widowhood continued, Sarah began to understand something that surprised her. Teaching Ruth, sharing the hard-won knowledge that kept desperate women alive, had given her own life a purpose that went beyond mere survival. She was no longer just Sarah the widow, Sarah the beggar, Sarah the invisible woman who existed in the margins of respectable society. She had become Sarah the teacher, Sarah the guide, Sarah the keeper of essential knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death for women facing impossible circumstances. This transformation hadn't come through any dramatic revelation or divine intervention. It had emerged gradually from the simple act of sharing what she had learned with someone who needed to learn it. In helping Ruth navigate the treacherous waters of widowhood, Sarah had discovered that her own suffering had produced something valuable: wisdom that could save lives. The network of desperate women that had once been her only source of support had gradually evolved into something more complex and purposeful. Information still flowed between them. Warnings about dangers and opportunities still passed through quiet conversations in hidden corners. But increasingly, Sarah found herself at the center of these exchanges, the person others sought out when they needed guidance or advice. She was becoming what every community of outcasts needed: an elder, someone whose experience could help others avoid the worst mistakes, someone who had survived long enough to understand the deeper patterns that governed their shadow world. It wasn't power in any conventional sense. Sarah still owned nothing, still slept wherever she could find shelter, still depended on charity and scavenging for her daily bread. But within the invisible community of discarded women, she had achieved something that her comfortable years had never offered: genuine respect based on knowledge and service rather than social position or family connections. This respect was earned through actions rather than inherited through marriage. It was based on her ability to help others survive rather than her relationship to men who provided protection. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah's value was determined by her own qualities and choices rather than her usefulness to a patriarchal system. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had achieved a form of independence and authority in the very circumstances that society claimed destroyed women. By losing everything that conventional wisdom said made life worth living, she had discovered forms of wealth and influence that she had never imagined existed. But even as Sarah found meaning in her role as teacher and guide, she never forgot the cost of the knowledge she was sharing. Every lesson she taught Ruth had been learned through suffering that no one should have to endure. Every survival skill she passed on was the product of desperation that revealed the fundamental failures of the systems that were supposed to protect the vulnerable. Her wisdom was valuable precisely because it was born from injustice. Her authority among the discarded women came from her ability to navigate circumstances that should never have existed. She was an expert in surviving situations that a just society would never have allowed to develop. This understanding kept her anger alive, even as she found ways to build meaning within her reduced circumstances. She never accepted that her suffering was necessary, or noble, or part of some divine plan. It was simply the predictable result of social systems that prioritized the comfort of the powerful over the survival of the powerless. Yet anger alone wouldn't keep Ruth alive, wouldn't help the other desperate women who sought Sarah's guidance. So she channeled her rage into something more productive: the patient work of teaching others how to survive in a world that wanted them to disappear quietly. Summer brought new challenges as the seasonal rhythms that governed charity and opportunity shifted once again. The brief period of relative abundance during harvest time was still months away, but the warm weather meant that outdoor survival became less immediately dangerous, freeing energy for longer-term planning. Sarah began to think beyond mere day-to-day subsistence toward more complex forms of mutual aid and community building. The informal network of desperate women that had sustained her through the worst years of her widowhood could be strengthened, made more systematic, more effective at protecting and supporting its members. She started organizing regular gatherings, not formal meetings that might attract unwanted attention from authorities, but casual encounters that allowed for the systematic sharing of information and resources. These sessions became schools where newly widowed women could learn essential survival skills from those who had already mastered them. The curriculum was unlike anything taught in respectable society: how to distinguish between edible and poisonous wild plants, how to treat common injuries and illnesses with herbs that could be found or bartered for cheaply, how to read the signs that indicated whether a potential employer or benefactor had ulterior motives. More subtly, Sarah taught the psychological skills that kept desperate people sane in insane circumstances. How to maintain hope without setting yourself up for crushing disappointment. How to preserve dignity while accepting charity. How to build relationships based on mutual aid rather than dependence. These lessons went far beyond practical survival skills. They were about maintaining humanity in circumstances designed to strip it away, about creating community among people who had been isolated by their fall from respectability. Ruth proved to be an apt student who gradually became a teacher herself, sharing her own discoveries and innovations with women who were even newer to the harsh realities of widowhood. The knowledge that had once been hoarded by individuals struggling to survive was becoming collective wisdom, a shared resource that made everyone stronger. Sarah watched this transformation with something approaching joy, an emotion she had thought lost forever during her first desperate years of widowhood. Not joy in suffering, not gratitude for circumstances that remained unjust and unnecessary, but satisfaction in the human capacity to create meaning and community, even in the most adverse conditions. The women she worked with weren't saints or heroes. They were simply human beings doing what humans do when faced with impossible circumstances, adapting, cooperating, finding ways to help each other survive. But in a world that insisted they were worthless, their mutual aid was a form of quiet revolution. They were proving that discarded people could still create value, that women without male protection could still protect each other, that communities could form and thrive outside the official structures of power and authority. This wasn't the life Sarah would have chosen for herself, or wished on anyone else. But within the constraints of circumstances she couldn't control, she had found ways to live that went beyond mere survival. She had discovered that even in the margins, even in the spaces between other people's stories, it was possible to build something meaningful. As the sun set on another day in her unlikely existence, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since Eli's death. A sense of tomorrow that held possibilities, rather than just more of the same struggle. Not hope for rescue or restoration, but anticipation of continued growth, continued learning, continued service to others who needed what she had learned. The widow's life would never be easy, would never match the security and comfort she had once known. But it had become something she could face without despair, something that contained its own forms of wealth and purpose, and even occasionally, moments that resembled happiness. In the growing darkness, surrounded by women whose stories paralleled her own, Sarah prepared for sleep with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had found a way to turn suffering into service, isolation into community, loss into a different kind of gain. The night was peaceful, filled with the soft sounds of women who had survived another day in circumstances that were supposed to destroy them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, new opportunities to prove that human beings could endure and even thrive in the spaces where the comfortable world insisted life was impossible. But as Sarah settled into the rhythms of this new purpose, teaching survival to women who shouldn't have needed such lessons, she began to encounter something that challenged even her hard-won wisdom about the nature of biblical society. There were women whose stories didn't fit the patterns she had learned to recognize, whose circumstances revealed layers of cruelty that went deeper than simple economic abandonment. There was Tamar, a young woman who arrived at one of Sarah's informal gatherings with bruises that spoke of violence rather than mere neglect. Her husband hadn't simply died, leaving her vulnerable to the indifference of relatives. He had been killed by those relatives, murdered for a piece of land that they claimed he had no right to inherit. They said he wasn't really my father-in-law's son, Tamar explained in the halting voice of someone still processing trauma. They said my marriage was invalid, that I had no claim to anything. When he tried to defend our home, they said he was a thief trying to steal what wasn't his. Sarah listened with the growing horror of someone discovering that the world was even crueler than she had imagined. She had thought she understood the worst that could happen to women in biblical times. Abandonment, economic displacement, social invisibility. These had seemed like the outer limits of institutional cruelty. But Tamar's story revealed something more systematic, more deliberately vicious. There were families, communities, even religious authorities who didn't just passively allow women to fall through society's cracks. They actively pushed them, manufacturing justifications for violence and theft that left widows with nothing and no recourse for justice. The elders at the city gate heard their case, Tamar continued, her voice growing smaller with each word. They brought witnesses who swore my husband was adopted illegally, that his father had been deceived about his parentage. They had documents, seals, testimony from men I'd never seen before but who claimed to have known the family for decades. Sarah recognized the machinery of corruption that Tamar was describing. In a society where women couldn't represent themselves legally, where their testimony carried less weight than men's, it was frighteningly easy to manufacture evidence that would justify seizing their property. A few bribes, some forged documents, testimony from men willing to lie for profit, and a widow could be transformed from rightful inheritor to illegal squatter overnight. "Where are you living now?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Nowhere," Tamar whispered. "They took the house, the fields, even my husband's tools. They said since the marriage was invalid, everything reverted to his real family. I have nothing, not even the right to mourn him properly, because they claim I was never really his wife." This was a refinement of cruelty that went beyond simple greed. Tamar hadn't just been robbed, she had been erased. Her entire identity as a wife had been retroactively declared fraudulent, her grief deemed illegitimate, her very existence as a widow denied by legal fiction. Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a rage so pure and focused that it momentarily overwhelmed her carefully cultivated acceptance of injustice. This wasn't the random cruelty of circumstance, or the passive indifference of a society that didn't want to be bothered with inconvenient problems. This was active, calculated evil, dressed up as legal process. But rage alone wouldn't help Tamar, just as it hadn't helped Sarah during her own darkest moments. The system that had destroyed this young woman's life was too vast, too deeply entrenched, too protected by wealth and authority to be challenged by desperate women with no legal standing. What Sarah could offer was something more practical, the knowledge of how to survive when survival itself had been criminalized, how to exist when your right to exist had been legally challenged. "The first thing you need to understand," Sarah told Tamar, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had navigated similar impossibilities, "is that justice and law are not the same thing. What happened to you was legal, but it was not just. And because it was legal, no one in authority will help you challenge it." This distinction was crucial for women like Tamar to grasp. The religious teachings they had grown up with spoke constantly of divine justice, of God's protection for the innocent, of righteousness being rewarded and evil punished. But the actual legal systems they lived under operated by different principles entirely: power, wealth, and the ability to manipulate procedures that were designed to favor those who already had advantages. Understanding this difference was the first step towards psychological survival in circumstances that seemed to make no sense. If you kept expecting justice from systems designed to produce outcomes favorable to the powerful, you would drive yourself mad with frustration and despair. "But if the law won't help me," Tamar asked, "and the religious authorities supported their decision, and even my own relatives won't take me in because they're afraid of being associated with a woman whose marriage has been declared fraudulent, then what can I do? How do I prove I was really his wife if no one will listen to my testimony?" Sarah recognized the trap that Tamar was caught in, the circular logic that made certain forms of injustice self-perpetuating. Once a woman's credibility had been officially challenged, Everything she said in her own defense became suspect. The very act of protesting the injustice was taken as evidence of the character flaws that supposedly justified the injustice in the first place. "You can't prove it," Sarah said gently. "Not in any way that the people who destroyed your life will accept. They didn't make their decision based on evidence, so new evidence won't change their minds. They made their decision based on what they wanted to take from you, and they found legal justifications afterward." This was perhaps the hardest lesson for someone like Tamar to learn, that the elaborate procedures of law and religious authority were often just theatre, performances designed to make theft and cruelty appear legitimate. The witnesses, the documents, the solemn deliberations of the elders, all of it could be manufactured when the desired outcome was valuable enough to justify the expense. "Then I really have lost everything," Tamar said, and Sarah heard in her voice the particular despair that came from having your fundamental assumptions about reality challenged. If the law doesn't protect the innocent, if religious authority can be bought, if even marriage itself can be erased by people with enough influence, then nothing is real. Nothing is safe. Sarah nodded, remembering her own moment of similar recognition years earlier. "Yes," she said simply. "Nothing is safe. But that doesn't mean nothing is real. You're real. Your love for your husband was real. Your grief is real. The injustice done to you is real. The fact that powerful people can lie successfully doesn't make truth disappear. It just means truth isn't always powerful." This was the foundation for building a life in the aftermath of total legal and social destruction. If you could hold on to your own understanding of what was real and true, independent of what authorities said was real and true, then you could begin to reconstruct meaning in circumstances that seemed designed to make meaning impossible. But Sarah also understood that philosophical clarity, however necessary, wasn't sufficient for practical survival. Tamar needed more than reassurance about the nature of truth. She needed specific knowledge about how to navigate a world where truth was treated as irrelevant. Over the following weeks, Sarah introduced Tamar to the shadow networks that kept discarded women alive. She learned which merchants might be sympathetic to someone whose husband had been murdered by corrupt relatives. She discovered which communities might be more tolerant of strangers with complicated histories. More importantly, she learned how to tell her story in ways that wouldn't immediately trigger the suspicion and blame that society directed toward women whose circumstances were unusual or controversial. Not lying exactly, but emphasizing aspects of her experience that made her seem like a victim of bad luck, rather than someone whose very existence challenged comfortable assumptions about law and justice. "Never mention the legal proceedings," Sarah advised. "People don't want to hear about corruption in the system they depend on for their own security. Just say your husband died and his family took everything. That's true. And it's something people can understand without having their worldview threatened." This was another skill that desperate women had to master: strategic simplification of their stories. The full truth was often too complex, too disturbing, too challenging to the foundations of social order for comfortable people to process. But simplified versions that fit familiar patterns of misfortune could sometimes generate sympathy and practical help. Tamar proved to be a quick learner, perhaps because her complete legal destruction had stripped away the illusions that made adaptation difficult for women who still had something left to lose. She learned to read the subtle signs that indicated whether someone might be willing to help or was simply gathering information for gossip. But even as she mastered the practical skills of survival, Tamar struggled with something that went deeper than hunger, or cold, or homelessness. She had been not just impoverished, but delegitimized, not just abandoned, but actively erased from the legal and social reality that defined other people's lives. "Sometimes I wonder if they were right," she confided to Sarah one evening as they shared a meager meal in an abandoned building. "Maybe I was never really married. Maybe I was just deluding myself. Maybe I deserved what happened because I was too proud, too certain that I belonged somewhere I didn't really belong." Sarah recognized this particular form of psychological torture, the way systematic injustice could make victims question their own perceptions and memories. When everyone in authority insisted that your version of events was false, when legal processes concluded that your entire understanding of your own life was mistaken, it became almost impossible to maintain confidence in your own experience. "That's exactly what they want you to think," Sarah replied firmly. "They want you to believe that their lies are more real than your memories. They want you to doubt yourself instead of doubting them. Because if you start believing their version of your story, you'll stop fighting for the truth." This was psychological warfare disguised as legal procedure, designed not just to steal property, but to destroy the victim's capacity to understand what had been done to them. If Tamar could be convinced that she had never really been married, then she would stop seeing herself as the victim of theft and start seeing herself as someone who had mistakenly claimed things that weren't hers. "But how do I know what's real?" Tamar asked. "If documents can be forged and witnesses can lie and even religious authorities can be corrupted, how do I trust my own memories against all of that official certainty?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, thinking about her own journey from naive trust in social institutions to hard-won understanding of how power actually operated in biblical society. The question Tamar was asking went to the heart of what it meant to maintain sanity and integrity in circumstances designed to destroy both. "You trust your memories because they're yours," Sarah finally said. "You were there when you spoke your wedding vows. You were there when your husband held you. You were there when he died. No document can change what you experienced. No witness can alter what you felt. No authority can rewrite what you lived through." This was the bedrock of resistance against systematic gaslighting. The insistence that personal experience remained valid even when it was officially denied. It wasn't a complete answer to the practical problems that denial created, but it was the foundation for maintaining psychological integrity while navigating those problems. But even as Sarah helped Tamar rebuild her sense of reality, she was learning disturbing lessons about the scope and sophistication of the systems that preyed on vulnerable women. Tamar's case wasn't unique or even unusual. Similar stories began to emerge as word spread through the network of desperate women that Sarah was someone who could be trusted with dangerous truths. There was Rachel, whose husband's business partners had claimed he owed them massive debts that could only be repaid by selling everything he owned, including his wife's dowry. The documents they produced looked official, bore the seals of recognized authorities, and were supported by the testimony of multiple witnesses. But Rachel knew the debts were fictional, manufactured to justify stealing her husband's profitable trading operation. There was Leah, whose in-laws had convinced religious authorities that her husband had died under suspicious circumstances, that she might have poisoned him to inherit his property. The investigation was conducted by men who had already decided her guilt, who interpreted every piece of evidence as confirmation of their predetermined conclusion. She was stripped of her inheritance and declared unfit for remarriage, condemned to permanent widowhood and poverty. These weren't random acts of individual cruelty. They were systematic exploitation of legal and religious procedures by people who understood exactly how to manipulate those procedures to achieve desired outcomes. The victims weren't chosen randomly. They were targeted specifically because their circumstances made them vulnerable and their resources made them valuable. Sarah began to understand that she had been fortunate in her own catastrophic fall into widowhood. Her husband had died of natural causes. Her brother-in-law's seizure of her property had been straightforward greed rather than elaborate conspiracy. Her loss of status had been the result of systemic indifference rather than active persecution. But for women like Tamar, Rachel and Leah, widowhood wasn't just the loss of protection and economic security. It was the beginning of a campaign of destruction designed to erase their legal existence entirely, to transform them from inconvenient heirs into non-persons who had no claim to anything they had once possessed. Understanding this difference required Sarah to expand her role as teacher and guide. It wasn't enough to help newly widowed women navigate the practical challenges of survival. She also needed to help them recognize and resist the psychological warfare that often accompanied their material losses. The cruelest thing they do, Sarah explained to a gathering of women whose stories had revealed the patterns of systematic abuse, is make you complicit in your own destruction. They want you to believe that you deserve what's happening to you, that you brought it on yourself through some moral failing or legal ignorance. This was the most insidious aspect of institutionalized injustice, the way it made victims responsible for their own victimization. If a woman could be convinced that her suffering was the natural consequence of her own inadequacies, she would stop seeking help and start accepting abuse as appropriate punishment. But we know better now, Sarah continued, looking around at faces that showed the hard-won wisdom that came from surviving impossible circumstances. We know that the systems that claim to protect us are often the same systems that prey on us. We know that justice and law are not the same thing, that religious authority and divine truth are not identical. This knowledge was dangerous in a society that depended on the fiction that its institutions were fundamentally just and its authorities fundamentally trustworthy. Women who saw through those fictions, who understood how power actually operated, who could teach others to recognize and resist systematic abuse, represented a threat to the comfortable order that benefited from their silence. But they also represented hope for the women who were still trapped within that system, still believing that their suffering was somehow deserved or inevitable. Sarah's network of discarded women was becoming something more than a mutual aid society. It was becoming a source of forbidden knowledge, a school for understanding truths that society worked hard to keep hidden. As the seasons turned and more women found their way to these informal gatherings, Sarah realized she was witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in her experience of biblical society. A community of women who owed nothing to male protection, who had learned to see through the lies that justified their oppression, who were teaching each other not just to survive, but to resist. It wasn't revolution in any dramatic sense. They had no weapons, no political power, no ability to challenge the systems that had destroyed their lives. But they had something equally dangerous, the capacity to see clearly, to speak truthfully, and to help others develop the same clarity and courage. In the growing network of women who had lost everything and therefore had nothing left to lose, Sarah saw the seeds of a different kind of wisdom, a different understanding of what it meant to be human in a world designed to deny the humanity of the powerless. The widow's life would never be easy, would never be safe, would never be officially recognized as valuable or important. But it had become something that even Sarah's comfortable years as a wife had never offered. A foundation for understanding how the world really worked, and how people who understood that reality might begin to change it. The night deepens around us now, and perhaps you've begun to feel the weight of these stories settling into your bones like winter cold. But before we let sleep carry us away from this ancient world of dust and desperation, there's one final truth about widowhood in biblical times that needs to be whispered into the darkness. You see, Sarah's story, Ruth's education, Tamar's erasure from legal existence, all of these individual tragedies were not accidents of fate or unfortunate coincidences. They were features, not bugs, in a system that had been carefully constructed to extract maximum value from women while providing them with minimum security. The biblical world that we've explored tonight was not a world where widowhood happened to be difficult. It was a world where widowhood was deliberately kept difficult because desperate women served economic and social functions that comfortable women could not. Who cleaned the houses of the wealthy when their own servants were busy with more important tasks? Desperate widows, grateful for scraps and a dry corner to sleep in. Who worked the most dangerous jobs, the ones that might result in injury or illness that no family wanted to risk? Women who had no family left to protect. Who provided the flexible labor force that could be hired during busy seasons and discarded when demand dropped. The widow, you see, was not just a victim of circumstances. She was a product manufactured by social systems that required a steady supply of powerless people to perform the tasks that no one else wanted to do. Her desperation was not a bug to be fixed, but a feature to be maintained, because a widow with options might make choices that didn't serve the interests of those who profited from her powerlessness. This is why the beautiful religious teachings about caring for widows and orphans remained largely theoretical. It's why the legal protections that supposedly existed for vulnerable women were so rarely enforced. It's why even well-meaning people found reasons not to help when help was desperately needed. The system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as designed. But here's what the architects of that system never anticipated. Women like Sarah, who survived long enough to understand the machinery of their oppression, who learned to see through the comforting lies that made cruelty seem natural and inevitable. They never expected desperate women to form communities that could function outside official structures of power and authority. They never imagined that the discarded could develop their own forms of wealth, their own systems of mutual aid, their own ways of preserving and passing on dangerous knowledge. Most of all, they never anticipated that women who had lost everything would discover something that comfortable people rarely find: the freedom that comes from having nothing left to lose, the clarity that emerges when all illusions have been stripped away, the strength that grows in the spaces where conventional power cannot reach. Sarah's network of shadow women was more than a survival mechanism. It was a quiet revolution, a proof of concept that human beings could create meaning and community and even joy in circumstances specifically designed to make such things impossible. In teaching other women how to read the signs of predators disguised as benefactors, Sarah was undermining the systems that depended on women's naivety to function. In sharing knowledge about wild plants and healing herbs, she was creating independence from the medical authorities, who charged fees that desperate people could never pay. In simply refusing to disappear quietly into death or madness, she and the women like her were bearing witness to truths that comfortable society desperately wanted to forget. These women became living proof that the official explanations for their suffering were lies. They demonstrated that virtue did not protect, that faith did not guarantee security, that following all the rules was no insurance against catastrophic loss. But they also proved something else, something that the comfortable world found even more threatening: that human dignity could survive the loss of everything society claimed made life worth living. That community could form among people who officially didn't exist. That wisdom could emerge from experiences that were supposed to destroy the capacity for wisdom. As our journey through this ancient world of forgotten women draws to a close, perhaps the most important lesson is not about the cruelties of biblical times, but about the resilience of the human spirit in any time, any place, any circumstances. Sarah began as a potter's daughter who became a farmer's wife, who became a discarded widow, who became a teacher of forbidden truths. Her transformation wasn't magical or divine or even particularly dramatic. It was simply what happens when human beings refuse to accept that their suffering is meaningless, when they insist on finding ways to help others, even when they themselves have almost nothing to give. In the end, the widow's story in biblical times was not just about loss and abandonment and systematic cruelty. It was also about the discovery that even in the margins, even in the shadows, even in the spaces between other people's stories, it was possible to build something beautiful. Not the beauty of comfort or security or official recognition, but the beauty of truth spoken in whispers, of kindness offered without expectation of reward, of wisdom shared between women who had learned to see the world as it really was, rather than as they had been taught it should be. So as you drift towards sleep now, let your last thoughts be not of the darkness we've explored, but of the small lights that flickered within it, the women who shared their bread when they had barely enough for themselves, the quiet rebellions against systems that demanded silence, the communities that formed and flourished in the cracks between official reality and actual truth. These lights still flicker in every age, in every place where power tries to convince the powerless that their suffering is natural and inevitable. They shine in the faces of people who refuse to disappear quietly, who insist on bearing witness to experiences that comfortable society would rather forget. The widow's tale is finished now, but the spirit that kept Sarah and Ruth and Tamar and all the forgotten women breathing in impossible circumstances, that spirit echoes still. In every act of unexpected kindness, every moment of solidarity between strangers, every choice to help rather than harm, the ancient wisdom of the discarded lives on. Sleep now, knowing that even in the darkest corners of human history, people found ways to create light. Dream of communities built on truth rather than comfortable lies, of strength that grows in the places where conventional power cannot reach, of the quiet revolutions that happen whenever human beings refuse to accept that their suffering is the price of someone else's peace. The night is gentle now. The ancient world has faded back into memory and story. But the lessons whispered by women who survived the unsurvivable, who found meaning in the margins, who transformed their pain into wisdom that could save others, these lessons remain. Rest well, friend. You have learned something tonight that comfortable people rarely discover. That the human capacity for resilience, for community, for creating meaning in meaningless circumstances, is perhaps the most beautiful and terrifying force in the universe. And in that knowledge, in that quiet revolution of understanding, perhaps you too have become a keeper of dangerous truths, a bearer of light in the darkness, a voice for those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. The widow's story is ended, but the spirit that sustained her, the wisdom that emerged from her suffering, the community that formed around her refusal to disappear, these things are eternal, sweet dreams.